Hello, and welcome to the Irish Aesthete. Previously, I was talking about Tyrone House, County Galway, and what a happy, serene place it was in the decades after its construction. You'll remember that the man responsible for building the house was Christopher French, who changed his surname to St. George in order to benefit from a legacy. He had also financially benefited by marrying an heiress, Anne Bingham, and no doubt her money helped when it came to paying for the new Tyrone house. Poor Anne died after only 8 years of marriage, leaving 3 small children to be raised by their father Christopher. In 1801, he handed over Tyrone House and estate to his son, Arthur St. George, seen here as a young man. In 1801, Arthur St. George had just married Lady Harriet St. Lawrence, eldest daughter of the second Earl of Howth. The generous behaviour of his father Christopher in handing on the estate while he was still alive to his son Arthur sounds rather admirable, until, that is, one learns that Christopher had meanwhile set up an alternative ménage just a few miles away with another woman to whom he was not married. The place which he built for himself was a miniature castle he called Kilcolgan. As Louisa Beaufort wrote in horror in 1808, Christopher St. George, she wrote, keeps a chère amie, and to please her is turned Roman Catholic. It must be an unpleasant circumstance to his son, who is a moral, domestic country gentleman, to have his father living so near him, not 2 miles from his gates, so despicable a life. Mr. St. George and his chère amie had 5 illegitimate children, all of whom had to be provided for, which would have been a drain on the family resources, not to mention putting a bit of a dent in its reputation. This was especially a problem because Christopher's son Arthur was then trying to claim the aristocratic title of Lord Athenry, which had belonged to his wife's grandfather. Ultimately, the claim failed, but not before Arthur had gone to a great deal of trouble and expense. Lawyers in those days were just as pricey as they are today. In any case, he also had other problems to contend with, not the least of which was his elder son, Christopher, who, it turned out, rather took after his grandfather of the same name. Born in 1810, by the time he left Trinity College Dublin in 1831, Christopher St. George had already embarked on a relationship with a Roman Catholic girl. She was called Honora Kane, and is thought to have come from Connemara, where the St. Georges owned a large amount of land. The couple would have no less than 10 children prior to marrying in 1861, and then another 2 afterwards. That's a dozen offspring who all needed to be looked after. And there were other drains on his resources, not least horses. Christopher St. George kept a stable on the Curragh in County Kildare. Racing has always been a very expensive hobby. And indeed, he was also one of the founders of the Galway Racers and an ardent huntsman. For a period, he even maintained his own pack of hounds. By 1841, the Spectator magazine could report that Mr. St. George is the proprietor of an extensive estate which not many years ago yielded him an unencumbered revenue of £10,000 a year. But he has managed it so as to become deeply involved and has been for some time obliged to conceal himself from the retainers of the law. Things got worse with the outbreak of the Great Famine in the mid-1840s. And in its aftermath, Christopher St. George was obliged to sell almost 30,000 acres of his land. He still had almost 16,500 acres, but outstanding debts remained on these, many of which had to be paid following his death in 1877. And in the next episode, I'll tell you what happened in the years after Christopher St. George's death, and ultimately what led to the downfall of Tyrone House. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.